A single block of ordinary processed cheese in a Tehran supermarket currently costs $5. In the same city, the official monthly minimum wage hovers at $130. Yet the number that defines the current reality of the Islamic Republic of Iran is 30,000. That is the conservative estimate of how many Iranian citizens, their own security forces, killed in a window of exactly 48 hours on January 8th and 9th, 2026. This scale of domestic slaughter does not signal a state operating from a position of absolute control. It signals an architecture that has entered its final stage of structural decomposition. To understand the mechanics of this collapse, one must look past the current naval blockade. The blockade did not create the fracture. It merely accelerated a kinetic sequence that had been building for decades. The foundational contract of the modern Iranian state was simple. The population endured ideological restrictions and global isolation in exchange for a guaranteed, livable baseline of material survival. That contract dissolved long before the first military engagement of the recent conflict. The acceleration began in June 2025, immediately following the 12-day conflict with Israel. In the weeks that followed, the Iranian rial lost 40% of its value against the US dollar. By October 2025, the annualized inflation rate breached 48%. Economic statistics ceased to be abstract metrics and transformed into physical weight. For millions of households, the daily caloric intake shrank because the currency had lost its fundamental utility as a medium of exchange. On December 28, 2025, the structural failure manifested on the streets. What began in the capital as a localized strike by bazaar merchants watching their capital evaporate transformed within 120 hours into a total domestic insurrection. The uprising did not follow historical patterns of concentration in urban centers. It ignited across all 31 provinces simultaneously. In western Iran, crowds overran provincial administrative centers. In Qom, the ideological capital of the theocracy, crowds forced security detachments to retreat from central squares while chanting slogans that dismantled 45 years of state legitimacy. In Lordagan, within the Chaharmahal and Bakhtiari province, citizens engaged state forces in direct, prolonged urban combat, converting residential quarters into fortified perimeters. By January 8, 2026. The inner circle of the regime reached its decision. The state deployed its entire internal security apparatus with instructions to utilize maximum lethal force without reservation. The resulting campaign compressed more state violence into 2 days than the country had witnessed during the entire protest waves of 2019 and 2022 combined. Independent documentation from local health authorities confirmed that between 30,000 and 36,500 individuals died from gunshot wounds in 48 hours simultaneously. The Ministry of Information initiated a total internet blackout. The digital isolation was absolute, severing 31 provinces from the global network. The primary objective was tactical: to prevent civilian coordination and erase the visual evidence of the execution sites. But the blackout achieved a secondary, unintended consequence. It obscured the precise moment when the internal mechanics of the regime's enforcement mechanisms began to rupture under the weight of its own actions. Tactically, the massacre achieved its immediate purpose. The streets emptied. The visible coordination of the opposition fractured under the impact of systematic mass casualty events. The state retained its monopoly on the administrative symbols of power. Yet, the strategic calculations altered permanently on January 10th. A political structure that requires the elimination of 30,000 citizens to secure a single season of survival has ceased to function as a government. It has transformed into a military occupation of its own territory, completely dependent on the physical willingness of armed men to pull triggers. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, has served as the physical spine of this structure since 1979. It is not merely a paramilitary organization. It is a corporate conglomerate that controls docks, telecommunications, petrochemical plants, and construction monopolies. The IRGC secured the absolute loyalty of its personnel by providing a parallel economy of material privileges, subsidized housing, guaranteed pensions, and hard currency bonuses that insulated its members from the economic degradation of the general population. The entire coercive capability of the state rested on this financial insulation. That insulation has failed. The state treasury is empty. Internal administrative notices confirm that the state disrupted the salary payments for police special units 3 times in a 90-day period. Following the third consecutive payroll failure, personnel refused to deploy to state-mandated counter-demonstrations in major metropolitan sectors. The geography of regime enforcement began to contract from the periphery toward the center, because the state could no longer fund the transport and sustenance of its forces. The decay extended rapidly into the regular armed forces. By April 2026, regular Army units and military retirees had gone 2 consecutive months without receiving basic compensation. At specific forward operating bases, domestic intelligence logs noted the unauthorized departure of entire platoons. In several critical internal security sectors, the cumulative desertion and absence rate approached 90%. This is a mathematical reality. Soldiers cannot deploy to the streets when their families face literal starvation at home. The physical indicators of this institutional unraveling are now visible in plain sight. Air Force pilots have systematically declined combat sorties following the unpublicized loss of a Yak-130 advanced trainer aircraft, citing a lack of technical maintenance. On active deployments, regular Army units are operating with depleted reserves of ammunition, rations, and potable water. Most critically, documentation reveals that IRGC personnel are actively refusing to transport wounded regular Army soldiers to available medical installations, prioritizing the conservation of their own remaining fuel. The state security apparatus has ceased to function as a cohesive institutional hierarchy. It has fractured into competing, isolated factions, each hoarding diminishing material resources to ensure its own immediate survival. Now layer the newly enforced U.S. naval blockade directly on top of this fracturing foundation. The primary revenue artery of the entire system has been clamped shut. An economy already operating on the edge of a precipice has just been pushed into freefall, and the velocity of the descent is accelerating. The physical mechanisms of state survival are grinding to a halt, and the countdown to a total systemic blackout has officially begun. The physical mechanism of this final phase is arithmetic and hydraulic. The U.S. naval blockade instantly severed the country's primary economic artery. In April 2026, ship tracking data from Clayplair recorded Iranian crude oil exports at 1.71 million barrels per day. Within 30 days, the blockade forced that volume down to 567,000 barrels per day, a 75% collapse. The immediate financial consequence is a direct loss of $500 million every 24 hours. This revenue loss triggered a catastrophic engineering dilemma beneath the surface of the Iranian oil fields. An oil well is not a valve that an operator can simply shut off. Halting production disrupts the delicate subterranean pressure balances that took decades to stabilize. If the pressure drops permanently, restarting these wells requires billions of dollars in foreign capital and advanced Western technology, resources the state no longer possesses. To prevent irreversible geological damage to its reservoirs, the regime initiated an emergency protocol known as floating storage. The state began pumping extracted crude directly into its aging tanker fleet, anchoring the vessels offshore as temporary holding vats. Satellite imagery analyzed by Bloomberg and Foreign Policy's Energy Desk revealed the exact geometry of this desperation. The combined capacity of Iran's onshore tanks and offshore vessels provides a maximum of 14 to 42 days of operational breathing room. Once these maritime containers fill to capacity, the pumps must stop. When the pumps stop, the fields die. The daily $500 million deficit instantly infected the domestic financial system. To sustain basic administrative functions, the central bank expanded the monetary supply without assets to back it, driving the currency into absolute freefall. The rial collapsed to an unprecedented 1.32 million units per single US dollar. The International Monetary Fund verified an annualized inflation rate of 68.9% for 2026, alongside a 6.1% contraction of the gross domestic product. These metrics translated directly into the physical starvation of the urban workforce. The state attempted to manage the resulting hyperinflation by issuing physical food coupons valued at $7 per citizen. In a market where a single block of processed cheese commands $5, this subsidy represents a mathematically impossible survival strategy. 2 million citizens lost their employment within 90 days as commercial supply chains snapped. Across Tehran, Mashhad, Avaz, and Karaj, the systemic dissolution of housing, employment, and public distribution networks erased the final remains of the social contract. This economic paralysis triggered an immediate structural vacuum at the apex of political power. Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, who assumed the position following the death of his father in the February 2026 U.S.-Israeli airstrikes, possesses no independent clerical or theological legitimacy. He remains entirely insulated inside a military perimeter. IRGC Commander Ahmed Vahidi has established a strict security cordon around the new supreme leader, systematically intercepting official state correspondence and blocking direct communication lines. This military isolation completely paralyzed the civilian government under President Masoud Pezeshkian. Vahidi repeatedly vetoed Pezeshkian's attempts to appoint a new intelligence minister to replace the official assassinated by Israel, citing wartime emergency protocols. The civilian administration entered a state of absolute executive deadlock. Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf and Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi found their diplomatic initiatives systematically overridden by the IRGC command structure, which now operates as an unaccountable shadow state. The structural incentives of the IRGC actively prevent any diplomatic de-escalation. The Guard's vast economic empire, spanning telecommunications networks, construction conglomerates, and smuggling routes, flourishes exclusively under conditions of international isolation and regional conflict. A negotiated settlement introduces civilian audits, competitive markets, and institutional transparency, which would dismantle the IRGC's financial dominance. Consequently, when Foreign Minister Araghchi attempted to negotiate an Islamabad-mediated diplomatic off-ramp, the IRGC Navy immediately sabotaged the initiative by executing kinetic strikes against commercial vessels in the Gulf on that exact day. As the financial baseline dissolved, the IRGC command modified its weaponization of the nuclear file, transforming it from a geopolitical bargaining chip into an internal survival tool. Under Vahidi's direct oversight, civilian enrichment constraints ceased to apply. The hardline faction accelerated enrichment toward weapons-grade thresholds to establish an absolute deterrent before the domestic infrastructure collapsed entirely. This operational shift removed all remaining diplomatic flexibility, locking the regime into an escalatory spiral that alienated its final international observers. Strategic partners in Moscow and Beijing rapidly adjusted their postures to this accelerating decay. While the Kremlin historically favored the predictable militarism of the IRGC for tactical weapons transactions, Russian intelligence assessed a total state collapse near the Caspian energy infrastructure as an unacceptable systemic hazard, freezing further technical support. Simultaneously, China halted its emergency financial credit lines as Iranian ports lost access to global shipping channels. Beijing's energy buyers refused to risk capital on stranded floating storage assets, leaving Tehran completely isolated from external economic lifelines. The pragmatist factions within the IRGC recognized the trajectory of this isolation and altered their calculations. Rather than defending the state apparatus, senior commanders began transferring personal hard currency reserves into offshore accounts via parallel networks in Central Asia. The internal security apparatus shifted its focus from national defense to proactive asset preservation. The state has entered the classic engineering phase of progressive collapse. The failure of the economic load-bearing element has transferred its weight to the financial system, which has in turn shattered the cohesion of the security apparatus. The oil tanks off Karg Island are riding lower in the water each morning, approaching their physical limit as the clock counts down to absolute structural stasis. The physical isolation of the country has mutated from an emergency response into a permanent structural reality. What international monitoring groups classify as the world's longest ongoing nationwide internet blackout is no longer a tactical measure designed to suppress street-level coordination. It has become a permanent infrastructure of informational containment. The regime has systematically replaced standard networking frameworks with imported Chinese routing hardware to install an absolute closed-state intranet. This is not a state managing an emergency. This is a political structure surgically removing itself from the global informational topology to ensure that the physical visibility of its domestic decay remains completely unquantifiable to the outside world. www.ironint.com. Behind this digital wall, the social landscape has flattened into a uniform crisis of material survival. The systemic freefall has entirely erased the concept of an economic middle class from the domestic data. The Ministry of Social Welfare confirmed that 57% of the population now suffers from documented malnourishment. Essential protein sources have vanished from urban distribution centers. Meat has ceased to function as a commercial commodity and has transformed into a historical luxury, completely unavailable to households where the monthly minimum wage cannot cover the cost of basic fuel. The economy is undergoing a permanent reduction of its material baseline, locked in an escalating inflationary spiral that has completely bypassed the regulatory instruments of the central bank. Wikipedia. Show 2. The administrative response to this systemic freefall consists of institutional theater. In April 2026, the regime established the Ministry of Crisis Administration and Prevention. This entity operates primarily by issuing dense legal regulatory frameworks to industrial facilities that have already ceased operations due to electrical grid failures and a total lack of raw materials. The civilian bureaucracy functions as an automated machine printing useless decrees. Allocation decisions regarding grain, medicine, and fuel are routinely delayed for weeks. Civilian administrators must wait for security clearances from regional IRGC commanders who refuse to answer official correspondence. The state has ceased to operate as an integrated network of public institutions, existing instead as an accumulation of isolated silos executing conflicting emergency protocols. Wikipedia. This domestic decomposition has officially breached the borders, transforming into a global systemic infection. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz has triggered what the International Energy Agency formalized as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. 1 billion barrels of projected oil production have been permanently erased from the global energy ledger. Brent crude remains locked at historic highs, forcing European and British industrial manufacturers to impose 30% surcharges to offset surging electricity and feedstock costs. The conflict has exposed the fundamental fragility of the Gulf Cooperation Council's economic model, freezing long-term infrastructure investment across the region as maritime transit routes remain absolute dead zones. Wikipedia Show 3. Within this matrix of international and domestic failure, the IRGC's rapid advancement of the nuclear file has achieved its technical objective while simultaneously sealing the regime's structural doom. The enrichment centrifuges at Fordow and Natanz have successfully established a threshold capability that operates as a physical barrier against direct foreign military intervention. Strategic planners in Washington and Tel Aviv acknowledge that a conventional ground campaign against a threshold nuclear power carries unacceptable systemic risks. But this ultimate insurance policy has produced a profound structural paradox. The nuclear capability can deter an external precision strike, but it cannot produce a single ton of domestic wheat. It cannot stabilize the exchange rate of the rial, and it cannot pay the monthly salary of a single border guard. The regime has expended its final reserves of technical and financial capital to build a weapon that preserves the physical shell of the state, while the interior of that state completely hollows out. This hollow architecture has finally reached the critical weight-bearing threshold where the internal loyalty calculus of individual state actors undergoes an irreversible shift. For 4 decades, a reliable arithmetic formula maintained the cohesion of the enforcement class. Protecting the system was safer and more lucrative than abandoning it. Today, that formula has flipped. When regional police chiefs, logistics officers, and lower-level paramilitary personnel look at the empty treasury accounts, the delayed payrolls, and the $7 food coupons, they no longer see a system that protects their status. They see a structure that they must protect at the direct cost of their own family's physical survival. The question of total collapse is no longer a debate regarding political willpower or ideological resilience. It is a matter of simple logistics. An armed man will execute civilians to preserve his material privileges. He will not execute civilians to protect a state that cannot guarantee him a loaf of bread. What remains of the Islamic Republic of Iran is a rigid, heavily armed casing surrounding an empty administrative center. There are no historical templates for a successful recovery from this level of structural decomposition. The financial reserves are gone. Permanent geological degradation destroys the infrastructure of the primary export sector, and systematic starvation has replaced the domestic social contract. The external blockade is not a temporary pressure campaign designed to force a diplomatic concession. It is a permanent economic containment structure, operating with the cold indifference of mathematics. The regime that killed 30,000 of its own people in 48 hours to buy a single season of survival is discovering that physics